brothers and sisters in Christ and family and friends. I've got a good one for you today. It is 1 Samuel chapter 23. And before we hop right in, let me give you a quick recap of what you can expect throughout this lesson. Specifically, Abiathar is the only remaining priest, and he's going to be using the Urim and Thummim for David's inquiries to the Lord. Specifically, God has informed David that he should take his 400 men and help the people of Keilah, whose threshing floors are being raided by the Philistines. Rather than help David fight the Philistines, Saul is pursuing David from Keilah to Ziph to Maon, and then Saul's chase is called off to fight the Philistines elsewhere. David then goes to En-gedi. So let's go ahead and hop right in and see where we're at here. Let's start with verse 1. Then they told David, saying, "Behold, the Philistines fight against Keilah, and they rob the threshing floor." So a little bit of background about Keilah. Keilah was a city within the tribe of Judah in Israel, located just south of Adullam. So David was previously in the cave Adullam, located in Adullam, and so Keilah is just south of this location. And in the previous chapter, we learned that David had acquired 400 people to his cave, so now he has a mini army here, a mini following to help him with what he needs to do. And so David gets word that the people, these Philistines, are going about and they're robbing these threshing floors. And so what the Philistines would do in this case is they would wait for the last part of these farmers to get the last step in this process. And so the farmers, they would go about and they'd plant the seeds and they'd water them and they would keep all the weeds out and would take such great loving care of their crops. And they got clear to the end. And this part of the process was where the farmers were removing the kernel grain from its stalk. So it's the removal process to get the final product that they could sell or they could eat. And so it was their livelihood. It was their way. There was something that they could eat and sell. It was their everything. And the Philistines were going about and they were robbing the people of that final product. It would be devastating to their economy, devastating to their livelihood, and absolutely devastating loss to these people. And so David inquires to the Lord and he says, "Do you want me to go and help the people of Keilah?" And the way that he does this is because he has, if you remember back, he has Abiathar the priest. He escaped Doeg's wrath when Saul told Doeg and said, "I want you to go and kill all the priests that are in Gad." And he goes about and he killed Ahimelech and he killed the other 84 priests. But what was good for Abiathar is he just narrowly escaped. And this was great for David. And now he has somebody that can inquire of God for him. And so Abiathar here is going to use these tools, Urim and Thummim. And it's not a specific process that we know exactly how it worked out. But based off little research, it's what is really known is that this is a yes and no sort of process. You would ask the Lord about something and you would give it a specific question. You'd say, "Should I go up to fight against the Philistines?" And God would give you a specific response in the sense of a yes or a no via this process. And so David might say, "Should I go and fight Keilah?" And the step here is that the Thummim, these are two of the stones. One of them is white, and one of them was black. And the Urim it would light up. It was something that could light up. But like I said, don't put too much emphasis in this. We're not 100% certain why this has occurred and how and the whereabouts of what's going on here. But what would happen is that Abiathar, the high priest, had his ephod. It said he had it in his hand. And so he would reach inside of a pocket within this ephod. And in one hand, he would grab a stone that was distinctive from the three. And this was the Urim. And he would grab that, and he would know because it was distinctive. It had some sort of shape or form that he could tell that this was the Urim. And then with the other hand, he would grab one of these two stones that were non-distinctive from one another, indistinctive from one another. You couldn't tell them apart. So he'd reach inside there, and so first David would ask, "Should I go up and help the people of Keilah?" And then Abiathar would reach in there. He would grab an Urim. He could feel that it was distinctive. And then he would grab a Thummim. It was indistinctive. And he'd pull them out and see what happened. And it's the whereabouts and exactly how this occurred. Did they throw them on the ground? Did this light up actually? Or was this or was there a different way that this process worked? This is the best we've got so far. We're not exactly sure what was going on with this, but this is, from what I've researched, this seems like the best guess that I could find. And so the Thummim was kind of like a yes and no response. If it was white, this meant a yes. Yes, you should go out and do the process. If it was black, this was a no. You should not do the act that you just inquired of. And then the Urim, where it would come into place, is that it would light up if it was something that was of God's will. And if it did not light up, this means that your request is uninspired. God is not answering your response. So it doesn't matter if you got a yes or a no. If it doesn't light up, it means nothing. And so if you remember back, there was that story of when Saul asked, he says, should I go up and fight the Philistines? And do you know what happened? It says God didn't answer. And likely what occurred here is that this Urim didn't light up. And so what that was indicating to Saul is God's not answering me. It doesn't matter what the person then pulls next about the Thummim, it was not going to occur. Okay. And so David inquires, and so that's where this process comes into play. Therefore David inquired to the Lord, saying, shall I go and smite these Philistines? And the Lord said unto David, go and smite the Philistines and save Keilah. So David is very wise in that he asked the Lord if he should smite the Philistines. So he asked the Lord, he's like, should I go up? Should I smite them? And he also says, should I smite? So the Lord said, go. And so he has a very specific question. Should I go and commit this act? And David is also wise later in his life in how he inquires of the Lord before going to battle. In 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 8, David says, or the verse specifically says, and David inquired at the Lord, saying, shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? And answered him, pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. So we can see David would often inquire of the Lord before going into battle. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 19 is another example. It says, and David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to the Philistines? Wilt thou deliver them into mine hand? And the Lord said unto David, go up, for I will doubtless deliver the Philistines into thine hand. And so you can see here the way that David would inquire, and if he would know if he needs to go up and attack them. Specifically, I like that last case. He says, shall I go up to the Philistines? And God, said, yes. Wilt thou deliver them into my hand? So he gave him a double question. He wanted to be very specific about what he desired, because the only way that they could ask this, to my understanding, was a yes and a no response. So you wanted to be very specific in that yes or no response. If you just said, should I go up? God might say, yeah, go ahead, go up. But it was important that if you also asked, will you deliver me, God? It gave you a little bit more information. So the more specific you could make this yes and no response, the better off you were in this process. And I also mentioned previously about Saul's attempt to be wise, Saul's attempt to inquire of God before he went to battle. Let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 37. And Saul asked counsel of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Wilt thou deliver them into the hand of Israel? But he answered him not that day. And this is what I was talking about here. I believe that when it says God didn't respond to him, I believe that this was the way that when the priest tried to reach in and grab his Urim and Thummim, I think that for Saul, it didn't light up. There was some sort of indicator in this process, whether that's the process that I'm describing here or some other process that we're unaware of. But through these tools, that was their way of inquiring of the Lord. And I hope that's really clear to you guys, that this is just the best guess that I could find. It's not 100% certain what the process is, but what we do know is that these were some sort of deciding stones, some sort of way of communicating with God. The method is not exact. We're not sure exactly what occurred here, but this appears to be the best guess when I was researching it. And so I think for Saul, I don't think this Urim lit up for him. I think that indicated to him that God was not on his side, and that this response and inquiry was not inspired of God. In 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 47, it says, so Saul took the kingdom over Israel and fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab and against the children of Ammon, and against Edom and against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines, and whithersoever he turned himself, he vexed them. So Saul previously asked, should I go up? And God didn't give him a response. And later it says that he had to fight against those Philistines for the rest of his life. Can you imagine if Saul was doing the right things, if he was a man that lived after God's own heart, like David would eventually be one that lives after God's own heart, a man of God's own heart. Verse 3, And David's men said unto him, Behold, we be afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we come to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? So David had a really difficult task here. I want you to imagine he has 400 people. Some of them were just kind of the nobodies of the city, as I was mentioning earlier. They're the people that were bitter, discontented. They didn't like their lives, so they came to David. They were trying to find a purpose, kind of like some of us. I know some people I've heard, they decide they want to join the army. They feel like they can't find their way in life. They kind of have this vacuum. They're like, I don't know what to do with myself, so I'm just going to join the army. And that's not to say for every case. That's not even close to what I'm saying here. But for some people, that's their decision of why they join the army, because they can't find their way in life. And so, in the case of this, that was a lot of people that came to David, including his own brothers. It says the brethren of his father's house. So they also came to him. And so he has this very difficult task of having these untrained 400. These were not a particularly trained group of individuals. It's not like it was like, oh, all the Israelite army, 400 of them got cut off and brought to me. That wasn't the case. And so he has this difficult task of motivating this 400, many of them likely untrained people, and getting them to get excited about defending the children of Israel, even though they are now outcasts being with David. They're the outcasts, but now they're going to come back into Israel. They're already in Israel, but they're going to come out of hiding to go and defend the people of Israel, in this case, Keilah. So a very, very difficult task here. You can imagine that his men were really scared. This was terrifying to them. Verse 4, Then David inquired of the Lord yet again, and the Lord answered him and said, Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will deliver the Philistines into thine hand. So I believe the Lord in this case once again, I believe Abiathar inquired of him, and then I believe the Urim lit up, and I believe that the white stone was also pulled, and that it was an indicator of yes, and it was inspired of God. And so I also want to compare David's wise decisions of inquiring of the Lord and even getting confirmation of the Lord. In verse 4 it says he inquired of the Lord yet again. He wanted confirmation that the Lord would deliver him. This is very similar to actually the case of Gideon. If you remember back the judge that was in, I believe is in Judges chapter 6, 7 area. And what he does here is he says before he went to battle he only had 300. David had 400, and Gideon was only working with 300 in this case. And specifically, the way that he knew that God was on his side is he asked for a sign of God. And what he did is he said, God, I'm going to check early in the morning, and I'm going to put some fleece out there. And if there's dew on the fleece and no dew on the ground, I know you'll deliver me. So he goes out there, checks the fleece that he put out the previous night or in the evening, and then he checked it, and he said, sure enough, there's dew on the fleece and no dew on the ground. That means that God has delivered me. He's shown that sign to be true. And then he goes, God, if I can just ask this one more time, let me ask again, please confirm that you are on my side. And so he checks early the next morning, and sure enough, this time there was no dew on the fleece, but there was dew on the ground. So it was the opposite case. Okay, and so that left him without doubt, knowing that God was on his side and would help him fight. And with that, only with 300 people, Gideon was able to fight against these Midianites, who it says they were like grasshoppers in multitude. And he was still able to deliver them with that very small number. And just so a little comparison of what the mindset of Gideon and David were, I believe they recognized a couple key concepts here. Let me read a couple of these key concepts. The first one is actually when David was talking to Goliath. And here's kind of the way this conversation went here. 1 Samuel 17:47. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And so David's talking to Goliath, and he's telling him, the battle's not won by sword or spear. And this is the exact reason why I personally believe that David could have killed him with anything, because God was on his side. I think if he didn't bring a weapon, I think he could have blew on Goliath, and that would have killed him. I think that was the plan of the Lord, that no matter what, David was on. God had the favor of the Lord, and he was going to smite this Goliath here. And then another verse that's similar to the 300 and 400, that few number, in a concept that Gideon and David must have recognized, was also in 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 6, and Jonathan said to the young man that bears armor, Come, and let us go into the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, For there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. And so that's the key part of that verse. There's no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. So by many or by few, God can save us. And so the combination of those two items there, and that the battle is the Lord's, and that God can save by many or by few, what a potent combo that was. And I'm sure that Gideon and David were convinced of those two things. They knew that when God was on their side, even with a small number, they could defeat those people. But David had to convince his people, Gideon had to convince his people that even with their small number, they could be successful. So they must have been very charismatic, and they must have been very moving to the people. Verse 5, So David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their cattle and smote them with a great slaughter. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. And it's interesting here because when I first read this, I thought that it may have just been, a few rogue Philistines that came in and they were robbing the threshing floor of Keilah. But sure enough, it says that when David came in there with his 400, it says he killed them with a great slaughter. So that what that insinuates or suggests to me is that there must have been a lot of Philistines going in and robbing the people. This must have been a formidable foe. But David still took his 400 and slaughtered them with a great slaughter. A bit redundant the way I said it there, but it's all right. Verse 6, And it came to pass, when Abiathar the son of Ahimelech fled to David to Keilah, that he came down with an ephod in his hand. And so this is what and it mentions that Abiathar was with David earlier in the previous chapter, and so I don't want you to be confused here and think that now he's back again, or this is the first time he's mentioned. So Abiathar has always been in the equation here. And so Abiathar has come to David with this ephod in his hand. Okay. And I also want to compare this verse about this Urim and Thummim with a little bit more details here. 1 Samuel chapter 28, verse 6. And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by your Urim, nor by prophets. So specifically here, it's actually interesting because there's many different verses in the Bible that refer to the Urim and Thummim. And this is not just some random witchcraft placed in the Bible. I don't believe this was witchcraft. I think this was something designated for the Lord. This was a way that they could communicate with God. And it says specifically in 1 Samuel 28 and 6, it gives 3 different ways that the people could communicate with God. This was one process, so with the Urim. Another process was dreams. Another was by prophets. So very interesting here. One more kind of a bonus verse for you guys is Revelation chapter 2, verse 17. It says, He that hath an ear, let him hear what this Spirit saith unto the churches. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the hidden manna, and will give him a white stone, and in the stone a new name written, which no man knoweth, saving he that receiveth it. And so I was looking at some commentaries about this verse, and they're suggesting that this white stone referred to in Revelation chapter 2, verse 17, may be referring to this white stone right here of the Thummim. Pretty interesting here, and that would have been the yes response. But it's also interesting here is if you look at the Greek word for white, in this case, of the white stone in Revelation 2 and 17, it can mean 2 things. It can also mean light. It can mean white, or it can mean light. It could mean a color, or it can mean the adjective of the light. So it's very interesting here. It could have been the Urim or the Thummim. A yes or an inspired by God. I'm not sure which one it comes to. You can respond in the comments and give your guess of which one you think it is. I'm not sure exactly. I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. Okay. Scroll down here. Verse 7, It was told Saul that David was come to Keilah. And Saul said, God hath delivered him into mine hand, for he is shut in by entering into a town that hath gates and bars. It's funny, when I was listening to my version of the Bible on Spotify, the voice actor for Saul is awesome. He's like, oh, he is shut in. I have got him. He's just so excited. And he's just like, I've encircled him. There's no way he can escape me now. And that's kind of the voice that Saul has here. I think I didn't really do it service the first time I read it, is that he's like, oh, he's shut in, I've got him now. And you can just imagine the maniacal craziness that is coming at David with this King Saul. Verse 8, And Saul called all the people together to war, to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. So besiege is kind of an interesting word here. Besiege can either mean people when they come in to defeat a city, or it could also mean when you try to encircle it and wait them out. So it could mean two different things here. And so this was Saul's plan. He thought he could besiege David, either go in and take him, or encircle him and trap him until they were starved out. I think it could have meant either way based off the context here. Verse 9. And David knew that Saul secretly practiced mischief against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring hither the ephod." So once again, it's really clear here that the decisions that David was making were assisted by Abiathar the priest via his ephod containing these Urim and Thummim stones. And sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, probably actually like Urim and Thummim. Okay, verse 10. Then said David, O Lord God of Israel, thy servant hath certainly heard that Saul seeketh to come to Keilah to destroy the city for my sake. Will the men of Keilah deliver me into his hand? Will Saul come down as thy servant hath heard? O Lord God of Israel, I beseech thee, tell thy servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Then said David, will the men of Keilah deliver me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will deliver thee up. So God is letting David know two things here. He's saying that Saul will come to get you in Keilah. If you stay here, Saul will get you and he'll come after you. The second thing he's telling him here is that the men of Keilah will deliver you to Saul. If you stay here, you're going to get delivered to Saul. If you go away, it's likely that the people of Keilah, they'll also let Saul know which way you went. This is not a good place for you. That's exactly what God's telling him here, is that you are not safe in Keilah. You got to get out of Dodge. You got to run away and find a better place to be. Verse 13. Then David and his men, which were about 600, get that, 600. I want to pause there for a moment. He once had 400, and now he has 600. Isn't that awesome? I imagine that some of the people of Keilah were moved by David, and maybe they joined in with him. That, or is on his travels towards Keilah, maybe some of the people that saw what was going on, 200 people had joined in on the fight. So let me read it again. Then David and his men, which were about 600, arose and departed out of Keilah, and went whithersoever they could go. And it was told Saul that David was escaped from Keilah, and he forbore to go forth. So somebody told Saul that David escaped from Keilah. My own opinion is that that was the people of Keilah. I think that they routed him out, they saw which way he went, and they told him. I suppose it also could have been Saul, but I think it was coming to pass what David had asked of Abiathar to predict, or to ask of God, when God specifically told him, the men of Keilah will deliver you to Saul. And so that I think that was that playing out right there. Verse 14. And David abode in the wilderness, in strongholds, and remained in a mountain in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God delivered him not into his hand. And David saw that Saul was come out to seek his life, and David was in the wilderness of Ziph in a wood. Okay, and so just so you're paying close attention to this, Ziph was located southeast of Keilah, and it's within the tribe of Judah of Israel. And so the people of Ziph are going to be called the Ziphites. I just want you to not miss that. So David is currently in Ziph, and and he's hiding away in Ziph, and the Ziphites are going to rat him out. They're going to tell Saul where David is. It's really terrible here. Verse 16, and Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David into the wood, and strengthened his hand in God. And he said unto him, fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee, and thou shalt be king over Israel. And I shall be next unto thee, and that also Saul my father knoweth. And I want you to remember back, so it seems like now Jonathan is on David's side. He's changed his heart. And I want to do a couple verses to remember back to when they split up here. 1 Samuel 20, verse 42 says, and Jonathan said to David, go in peace, for as much as we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever. And he rose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. So there once was this ending where Jonathan, if you remember back when Jonathan wanted to give David a safe sign, he says, well, I'm going to go to my father, and I'm going to find out if it's safe for you to come back to the city. And I'm going to give you a sign so you'll know if you can come back or if you need to leave. And so what I'll do is I'm going to have my lad go out there to fetch my arrows. And if I tell my lad that the arrow is beside thee, then that means you need to come back. But if the arrow is behind the lad, that means you need to go away. And so what happens here is he shoots some arrows. He says, lad, go and fetch them. And the lad goes to fetch them. And then he shoots an arrow behind the lad. And then that was the sign to David. He needs to get out of there. It was a safe way to indicate to David that he needs to leave. And so then Jonathan later tells him that the Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever. So I want you to remember that he once said, all my kids will be against your kids, and there's going to be this split between us. And now it's like it's coming back together. It's almost like it's being glued back together. It once was cut apart, and now it's glued back together. Verse 18, and they two made a covenant before the Lord, and David abode in the wood, and Jonathan went to his house. Not only that, remember previously, 1 Samuel 18:3, it says, then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. So they once made a covenant, and then once they departed from one another after that sign that it was no longer safe for David to be there, then that covenant was broken, and now the covenant is back together. Okay, verse 19. Then came up the Ziphites to Saul to Gibeah, saying, doth not David hide himself with us in strongholds in the woods in the hill of Hachilah, which is on the south of Jeshimon? So the Ziphites, they ratted David out here. They told Saul where he went. 20. Now therefore, O king, come down according to all the desire of thy soul to come down, and our part shall be to deliver him unto the king's hand. And Saul said, blessed be ye of the Lord, for ye have compassion on me. So Saul is telling the Ziphites, oh, thank you, you had so much compassion on me. Now I can find my enemy David. Verse 22. Go, I pray you, prepare yet, and know and see his place where his haunt is, and who hath seen him there, for it is told me that he dealeth very subtly. See therefore, and take knowledge of all the lurking places where he hideth himself, and come ye again to me with the certainty. And I will go with you, and I will come to pass, if he be in the land, that I will search him out throughout all the thousands of Judah. And they arose and went to Ziph before Saul, but David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the plain in the south of Jeshimon. So David just narrowly escaped from Ziph, and now he's on to Maon. The people, the Ziphites had ratted him out, now he's on to the next city. Verse 25, Saul also and his men went to seek him, and they told David, wherefore he came down into a rock, and abode in the wilderness of Man. And when Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Man. So then he's ratted out. He needs to leave from Man. And Saul went on this side of the mountain, and David and his men on that side of the mountain. And David made haste to get away for fear of Saul, for Saul and his men compassed David and his men round about to take them. So David's in Man, and now he's been encircled by Saul. It's bad news. Surely this is going to be the death of David, but it doesn't occur, because what happens is God allows for an event to occur that's going to get David out of this. And what happens is message gets to Saul, even though he has his enemy encircled, message gets to Saul that he needs to come back and he needs to fight the Philistines. Whew. Narrow escape for David. He just barely got out of there. Oh, that's so good for David. Okay. Verse 27. But there came a messenger unto Saul, saying, haste thee, and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land. Wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David, and went against the Philistines. Therefore they called that place Selah Hamaklekath. I think I said that right. And David went up from thence, and dwelt in strongholds at En-gedi. So now David has escaped from that previous location, Maon, and now he's in to En-gedi. So he's escaped from his the person who seeks to take his life. And so at this very moment, David is safe. He's gotten away from his enemies, and the number of his army has increased from 400 to 600, and maybe even during this process it's increased even more. So we'll see and find out what occurs to his number, and what is to befall David next. And so just as a quick recap, this is the same thing I said at the very start, is that Abiathar, the only remaining priest, uses this Urim and Thummim for David's inquiries to the Lord. And so, specifically, God has informed David that he should take his 400 men and help the people of Keilah, and he does. And with a great slaughter, he kills these Philistines. And then Saul is hot on pursuit, and he's after David, and he takes David from Keilah to Ziph to Maon, and then eventually David escapes to En-gedi because Saul was called off to go and fight the Philistines. That's all I had on the lesson today. I hope that is beneficial to you. I never want any lesson without going to the plan of salvation, which is to hear, believe, repent of our sins, confess that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And one more reminder, this may not be the exact process. But the key point of this was some sort of way of inquiring of God from a priest to know a yes and no response. And it is very clear by the scriptures that at the very least we know that. Take care. God bless.